Mary, appreciate you carving out some time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to speak on your podcast.
Well, listen, I think a great place to jump off here today would be to give listeners a little whirlwind tour of your journey and your career and into your current roles with the Falcons, Hawks, and the Braves.
So, a little bit of about my background. I have an exercise science degree from UNC Greensboro, and then a master's degree in foods and nutrition, specialization in sports nutrition and bone health from University of Georgia, where I worked with the student athletes. Phenomenal experience there. And it's funny, I always tell people I was an endurance athlete. My last 3 years of college, my first year I actually played softball and soccer, and I came in thinking, oh, okay, I only want to work with endurance sports. And then I worked with the football team and loved it because it's a high-need sport, right? There's always something to do with nutrition, with hydration. We were just talking about how it's like a car crash every Sunday due to the collisions on the field. So high need. They were very interested. Just fell in love with the sport, working with the athletes. And then I started working at like training facilities in Atlanta, doing quite a bit of writing online, so writing for Men's Health and other magazines. I think my voice, the way I talk, like the communication style is more geared toward men. It's a little bit more direct.
Yeah.
And then, at some point someone introduced me to the Thrashers, our hockey team, which Canada stole from us. No, I'm just kidding.
Sorry about that.
Winnipeg welcomed them with open arms, right? So that was good to see them get the fan base. And so I worked with them for a couple years before they left, and then I ended up at the Hawks, and then which I've been there over 10 years. The Braves, I started there 7 years ago. I was there a couple years, and then off a couple, and then I'm back. And then the Falcons I've been with 3 years.
Amazing. So much knowledge and wisdom and insights from all those years working in elite sport, and of course with your background. So maybe a good place to even start here is to just talk about nutrition philosophy. In working with athletes, is there a certain philosophy that you bring to how you like to apply performance nutrition?
Yeah, I always say I like to use science and experience to optimize every aspect of performance, recovery, and health through better nutrition, hydration, and sleep. And I throw the word experience in there because, what I always say, you can't do everything in a lab or on the field that you do in a lab. It's just not practical, and it just doesn't work, whether it's schedule, whether it's field conditions. So I combine both to give that optimal mix of, okay, here's what I think is going to work with this athlete right now.
Yeah, it's always fascinating how whether we're talking nutrition, training, medicine, obviously even, what we learn in studies and even read in literature, when it comes time to putting these things in practice, there's always many, many nuances that come up, and it's not exactly how it was in the study or in the textbook. And so it's being able to implement those things with athletes, and of course with elite athletes, there's we run the gamut in terms of compliance of different athletes, and
yeah.
That's a good segue to talk about. Again, I'm sure whether it's a strength coach, nutritionist listening in, not all elite athletes have high compliance.
Oh no.
And sometimes oftentimes obviously the ones with lower compliance are the ones that we think could make the bigger gains and impact their performance the most. So, what are some strategies that you might have, or how do you approach those maybe conversations when you're dealing with an athlete who has low compliance and you need to get some strategies in place?
Yeah, and like you said, that's always a tough one. I know you've seen it a lot as well. And sometimes I've found that it's because they may not understand how you can help them. So they may have been in a situation before where they never had a nutrition expert. They didn't have someone guiding them. So they think, oh, this is only about weight loss or weight gain. Mm-hmm. They don't realize all of these different ways that nutrition or hydration can impact their performance on the field and their recovery and how they feel off the field. So sometimes I try to start with those conversations and then try to get them to make one change that is not that painful. Meaning, they might love, the sugary desserts every single day. I might not touch that initially. I might because even touching that might not make a difference, right? It might take a couple weeks before they go, oh, I have more energy. I'm not eating,
For sure.
so much less healthy food in my diet. So I try to do that, and then also pull their pain points. So whatever they can improve on the field, on the court, whether it's, let's say, field goal percentage, whether it's, hey, they're not reading the defense well enough, maybe it's reaction time. And then, oftentimes I'll ask them, give me a week or two, and I want you to do one thing. And sometimes it might be sleep. It might be, hey, let's go to bed at 11 o'clock every night, turn your phone on silent, tell me how you feel. And if that works, then we'll go to step 2. But here's what I think is going to happen, on the field, on the court, etc. So I always try to talk in their language, not, these abstract terms like, oh, energy, etc. Well, how's that going to help me when I play? Well, here's what's going to happen, when you're playing. Yeah. And then another thing I do is I say I'm their shadow. That's kind of a joke, but if they're not compliant, let's say, like I've got some football players that their weight is a little bit low consistently, and I sit with them for breakfast, for lunch, like I'm with them on the field, and I'm like, oh, I'm shadow. Awesome. And eventually, it's funny, but eventually they start going, oh, it's like, oh, this person cares a lot about me, and they start to listen a little bit more, and they'll start to do minor things. Their weight might not change a lot initially, but they start to buy in because they're like, this person's spending a lot of time and effort with me.
Yeah, it is amazing how that presence, plays such a big role. And as you mentioned, the person realizes you're invested in their outcome, and all of a sudden,
oh yeah,
those little things you've been saying that you haven't seen much movement on, now all of a sudden you're getting some momentum. And I love the idea, your strategy of obviously really tying it to some outcome some tangible outcome, because I think sometimes even in clinical practice we talk to clients about health, and it's such a nebulous sort of term where it's like, well, what, how can you improve, how can you affect the one thing in the next 7 days or 14 days, give them something concrete that they can really work around. And so those are terrific tips. And if we obviously pro football, contact sport, we were talking beforehand, like a car crash every week, it's incredible. And this time of year, recovery is obviously massive. Heading into the end of the year when players are tired and run down, heading into the playoffs, when we think about recovery nutrition, are there certain areas for you that you would, focus on or prioritize with players when we get into the end of a long, grueling season?
Yeah, and it depends here again on the player. And it's funny, like I always joke the offensive line, like I'm like, I don't worry about you guys. You guys eat regular meals. And one of them last week he goes, Marie, some people skip meals. I said, yeah, they skip meals. So, I'll start with the big 3. Hey, I want you to consume regular meals, whether that's 3 or whether it's 5, just to get your calorie needs in, 4 or 5. Consuming something right away after practice. It could be a drink, as long as they have at least carbohydrate right away. Because I find, and I've not seen research on this, but I find when they consume something immediately, whether it's after a game or after practice, they generally feel better the next day. It's not, hey, I know they can restore their glycogen, right? After a 4 o'clock practice, by the time they get on the field the next day, they've got all night, right?
Yeah,
but that's not the thing. They tend to feel a lot better, and they have more energy in meetings at night. They stay awake. And then, so it's those 3 things: regular meals, consuming food right away, and staying hydrated every single day, not just on the field, but every day. Those are the 3 big recovery nutrition things. And then after that, if they've mastered that, I'll layer things on like, hey, you have to have color at every single meal. And one thing I've found is that when people add, the fruits and vegetables, and they eat a lot more of them, they feel better. They're getting those plant compounds that help with recovery. They help keep your tissues healthy, etc., and they feel better. So I'll layer those things on.
Yeah, it's terrific when you think about, obviously, 2 birds with 1 stone there. When you get the carbohydrates and the hydration after practice with some kind of drink is a terrific strategy. And it is amazing when we look at even polyphenol intake across the board, that in the general population about 50% of polyphenols is from coffee and tea. And so if we get athletes that aren't consuming those, just as you mentioned, getting that plate to look pretty darn colorful is important, isn't it? To be able to get all those polyphenols in, and yeah, they just tend to feel better. And it's amazing, isn't it, the mindset piece of once somebody feels better, whether it's placebo or not, then other things tend to improve as well, whether it's performance in the field, recovery, even just mindset of facing challenges.
The other thing sometimes I'll do, and it works well in basketball especially, is I'll find a vet and have them kind of, help a younger guy, because I'm not with them all the time. So I'll pull aside a vet and say, hey, can you take him out to dinner? Or can you eat with him a few times and talk to him about this? Because they're very willing to help their teammates. And, sometimes they can get them to try new foods. Like last year, I pulled aside Jeremy Lin, and he could get some of the younger players to try new foods. And he has a great knowledge of food and nutrition and stuff. And then the players will do it, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that actually was pretty good. I don't mind fish, or I don't mind whatever vegetables there." So it's train the trainer approach.
I love that. It's such a human thing, isn't it, to have a peer or somebody that a young player holds in high regard, and they just
Yes.
see them eating something, and no matter how many times you may be able to tell them to eat that thing, just one experience of sitting down with a player, or maybe it's a coach for another person, and all of a sudden the habit changes, or the mindset of that food and the whole experience changes. And so that's such a great way to kind of nudge athletes towards the outcomes that we want without always having to tell them. There's obviously a place for education, but I think sometimes we try to beat them over the head with education all the time.
Yeah.
When some of those softer strategies, as you mentioned, at the end of the day, get the job done, and sometimes perhaps even better, really, don't they?
Oh, for sure. And another one on our team this year, Vince Carter. So I'll use them as examples. Hey, how do you think he's played 22 years? And even if you don't want to play 22, let's say your goal is 10, you got to be able to last 10 years, and you're not going to last on the diet, that fast food or college diet. And I'll give multiple examples of athletes that they look up to and they know.
Yeah, that college diet definitely catches up with you by the time you hit late 20s, 30s, and
100%.
We had a similar experience when Steve Nash came on board as the GM for Canada Basketball, because all of a sudden these players can see a guy who played until he was 40, and how can you keep going in your 30s when you're, when it, that much, all the back-to-backs and all the load. Basketball, obviously, a lot of intensity and the amount of movement and kilometers covered. So it's huge. And obviously now we're gearing up in the NBA season. January is when things really start to kick into gear even a little bit more. And of course, that's cold and flu month, right? That's the highest incidence of cold and flus. And so when we talk immuno-nutrition, strategies to keep athletes healthy, how can we do this? Or do you have some recommendations on some of the things that you might be telling your players?
Yeah, I mean, aside from number one, washing your hands.
I love that. It's such a number one.
And staying away from people who are sick. I always say what feeds the gut feeds the immune system, since about 2/3 of the immune system is in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's again where I'll go back to fibrous plants, fruits, and vegetables, and also some of the compounds in fruits and vegetables, like the carotenoids, which convert to vitamin A. We need that for immune system functioning. So look for foods high in vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, etc. All those nutrients that are important for immune system functioning. Oftentimes I do give athletes, or suggest, a multivitamin just so they can cover their micronutrient needs.
For sure.
And then I also like probiotic-rich foods, not necessarily a supplement, but just naturally getting, let's say, yogurt or kefir, those foods in them to ensure that they're putting good bacteria in their body, and then again feeding those bacteria with those high fiber foods. That's really the starting place for immune nutrition.
Yeah, definitely after that post-holiday refeed and sugar rush and everything else, the gut biome sort of taking a bit of a shift. So really good idea to be able to get those foods in. And of course, you mentioned the carotenoids and all the, a lot of those orange-colored vegetables, the precursors to vitamin A. I mean, all the different soups and things that you can try to get in to help players out is.
Soup, another great one. I'm glad you brought that up. Is that something that you incorporate a lot in your athletes' diets?
The ones that I support through year round, we definitely try to get a lot of soups in. I mean, with Canada Basketball, we're oftentimes in the summertime, so not as much there, but definitely, wintertime. It's as you mentioned, between the hydration piece and all the polyphenols and the nutrients, it's a pretty nice way to be able to get more calories in a pretty easy, easy way to take down. And the other thing that happens obviously in pro sports is all the plane travel, right?
Oh.
So on planes, off of planes. I mean, you just mentioned obviously hand washing is huge. I've seen studies upwards of 40% reductions in cold and flu just from frequent hand washing. Apart from that, what are some things that you try to emphasize with players? I know it's always difficult, but when they're getting on planes and having to travel a lot, how to reduce the infection rates?
Yeah, hydration number one, because they tend to get dehydrated on planes, and then I like to add some of those, and again, I've got a lot of guys that have a tough time, whether it's basketball or football, they have a tough time maintaining their weight. So that's when I don't turn to just water, but hey, let's add 100% orange juice or some of these dark berry juices, because I'll kill a few birds with one stone, right? I'll get those plant-based polyphenols, which you mentioned. I'll get vitamin C for immune system functioning, which some of them don't get a lot of vitamin C because they might not eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. Mm-hmm. And then I'll get hydration as well. And then also imperative, which is tough when you're crossing time zones, is sleep, right? We know that if they don't get enough sleep, their immune system is not going to be functioning on full steam.
Yeah, it's incredible how that lack of sleep. Sheldon Cohen's classic study there in the 90s where less than 7 hours and you're about threefold increased risk, and as you got less than 6, I think it was about a 4.5-fold increased risk. So it's definitely one that athletes, and I'm sure parents with young children can also attest to. It's like
I'm sure,
exposure rates go up and sleep goes down. It's the perfect recipe for catching more colds and flus. And
yep.
It definitely works its way around locker rooms. I think already this year we've seen some teams in football and basketball experience that. And is that something where then the medical staff will get involved for you guys in terms of IVs and things like that?
Yeah, they will. And then, the other thing I see a lot, and, I'd rather people wash their hands, but hand sanitizer everywhere, that is helpful. Mm-hmm. Because I think oftentimes, and especially, let's say, on a plane, people get on a plane, they're, put their luggage places, they're touching all these surfaces, and then they sit down and they might be served food, and they don't think, hey, I should wash my hands before I touch that sandwich. So that's a huge, like you mentioned, that's a huge environment, but I see hand sanitizers a lot. That can be very helpful. And then another thing is ensuring that you get enough calories. I'm big on that because, as I always say, if you don't have enough total calories, something's got to give. And it could be healing, if you are recovering from an injury. It could be an immune system suppression. So it's important to get enough total calories in every day. And as the season wears on, some athletes, it's work. It's work to get that many meals, and it's work to consistently have a shake every day. And I understand that. I had to take weight maintenance or gain shakes in college for a period of time. So it's constant reminders and trying to come up with new ways to ensure that they get everything they need and they consume enough calories for immune system functioning.
So important, isn't it, that idea, total energy, you mentioned carbohydrate and protein, these big rocks for maintaining mm-hmm. immunity. And sometimes we tend to, or athletes and clients will tend to just focus on those micronutrients, the smaller buckets, the vitamin C's, the vitamin D's. And whilst they have importance, if we're missing those big rocks, as you mentioned, like the energy intake and carbohydrate intake, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle. So that's...
oh, yeah. And then they're just tired all the time. And when you're tired, you don't even feel like getting up to go get food or, taking the effort. I had one athlete who said, well, you usually Uber Eats. That's not that much effort. Why did you eat 2 meals, not 3 meals? Yesterday, this was a while ago, and, it just happened to be a day off. He just goes, he goes, even if my stomach's growling, I don't feel like getting up to get food. And I thought, wow, okay.
Yeah, it's a great little red flag, isn't it? Because oftentimes athletes you just don't realize that the meal frequency goes down when they're just a bit tired or run down. Mm-hmm. And, that, just as you mentioned, don't you want to make yourself a meal? And once you don't want to order Uber Eats, that's probably another level up, isn't it? That's like...
if you and I are in this field, we can't imagine it, right?
Yeah.
But, there are people that will just sit there and let their stomach growl and, go about their day. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, and I suppose on that note, you've obviously, with all the experience you've had working across all the major 4 sports, if you look back over your career, what were some of the biggest realizations or potentially challenges that you encountered, over the course of those years working in pro sports and up until today?
I think, there's so many challenges. That's the big thing. And you brought up some of them. Travel is huge. Baseball travel is absolutely astronomical, right? 162 games a year. Scheduling. And sometimes it comes down to, hey, they want a life. They want to go out and hang out with their friends late, and then they don't wake up in time to get breakfast. And hey, I myself would prioritize sleep over breakfast. I get that. So I have to figure out a way for them to literally grab something out of the fridge and just go. Food, and this is big, especially in like minor league baseball. There are cities where your food options are pretty much like Walmart. Mm-hmm. So food options can be a big challenge. And the last one I can really think of, and I'm sure you run into this all the time, is that inaccurate information. So we're always up against what they hear in the media, what big documentary is out there,
Sure.
what fad is out there, and some of these aren't necessarily fads. I'm not against the ketogenic diet. Obviously, it's got it's amazing for those with medication resistance epilepsy, and then there are other scenarios where it can be beneficial.
Sure.
But when you have a high intensity athlete that tries it, you're like, okay, here's why, your neighbor lost a lot of weight. You don't need to lose weight. You got to go run on a field. So it's all of those things and trying to, break down the nuances of a very complex science. Nutrition's complex at times.
Yeah, it's definitely complex, and it's bathed in the human emotions, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
I'm always amazed at our sports psych, Peter Jensen.
Oh, gosh.
90% of every decision we make is based on emotion, right? And you just touched on the documentaries, and of course, Game Changers has been making the rounds, and again, a lot of great benefits potentially from vegetarian, vegan diets, but definitely something where all of a sudden, just as you mentioned, your neighbors tried something, or now you've seen a documentary, and the amount of athletes I've had in the last few months reaching out, thinking, hey, I can kickstart, this recovery or performance, so before I give my side here, I would just like to, before I skew your opinion here, when you watch the film, what are some of the biggest misconceptions maybe that are relayed to athletes that could potentially be problematic or need to be, talked through with a nutritionist or dietitian?
I think you hinted to the first one, and that's that, hey, I can easily make this switch. And it's funny in that film because it's almost like they went back and forth between plant-based and vegan, which are, obviously two separate things. So I'm constantly explaining the difference between the two, with vegan being, hey, no animal foods at all, and plant-based, hey, you can have, eggs, you can have some dairy, you can have some chicken, etc. But I think what you touched upon, that they think I could just switch, I could eat this without any planning and without any major knowledge. And obviously that's not the case. And I've had a lot of athletes, and I can't wait to hear your opinion on this too, and your experience, but I've had a lot of athletes come to me, and I'll kind of talk them through it and go, hey, you weigh 240 pounds, here's what it's going to take. Here's how much food you're going to have to eat to get enough total protein and get those building blocks, those amino acids, to maintain your muscle and repair your muscle. Here's a way that you can do it, though. You can still be plant-based, but you can still have some of these other foods. So that's one thing. They think it's really easy. Second, and they went into, and I've got a couple Instagram posts about this, I've got a couple more coming, but they went into how animal proteins produce all these compounds. They mentioned advanced glycation end products, TMAO, heterocyclic Those are very complex topics, and they're not very cut and dry. And we don't have research on every animal food and the production of these compounds. So that's another one.
There's no consensus at the moment, and watching the film, it seemed like there was a consensus to the viewer if they weren't up to speed, right?
Oh, very much so. And then the other huge one that I find in a lot of documentaries is that they say, hey, just make this switch and, you'll feel better and all these miraculous things will happen. And as I always say, is it really the fact that you went vegan, or is it the fact that you stopped eating Fritos, drinking beer, and drinking soda, and now you're actually eating something that has color in it? Which is it? Because it's not necessarily that you made this drastic change and went vegan. You probably could have achieved that by having those animal-based foods, right? By having, whether it's salmon, whether it's, turkey, etc. But, you also took out a lot of foods in your diet and a lot of drinks that are not healthy, that are going to run you down, basically.
Yeah, it's amazing how removing that processed food just becomes part and parcel with most changes to a different diet, and particularly vegan, vegetarian, or plant-based diet. And the term plant-based is also, incredibly confusing, because any athlete who's eating 15% of their 15% of their diet is protein, even if they're, let's say, 1.6 grams per kilo of protein intake, they're still effectively plant-based if they're eating a lot of vegetables. And so I think it's very they're almost trying to straddle that line, because it almost seems like they're, as someone who was 20 years ago, I was a vegan, and I understand the arguments well, and it's obviously tremendously helpful to eat a lot of vegetables, and it's funny how it's always presented as a bit of a false dichotomy between you either eat only animal products or you eat only vegetables.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I agree with you on plant-based. There's no, as I always say, there's no uniform definition for plant-based. So what I consider plant-based, someone else might not consider plant-based. But yeah, it's that I do like that film for highlighting the beneficial aspects of fruits and vegetables. Of course, they could have done a better job in highlighting why they're important for athletes. But because they were so focused on like, hey, eat this, not that approach. Don't eat meat, eat this. But I do like the fact that that conversation has started about, here's why you need some color in your diet. I mean, I have seen athletes over the past 2 years, especially after they get injured, after that What the Health movie, that was another one, but where they've started to actually, you see them at the salad bar now, or you'll see them asking for spinach in their omelet, and I'm like, oh, okay, wow, you've made some major strides.
Absolutely. I think that's such a great, eating more vegetables is phenomenal for most people most of the time. And so I think that was one of the great messages of the film. I think debunking a lot of the misnomers around soy protein intake as well. I think that's definitely one that comes up often. And so I think it's always that line of, I think for most of the film it seemed that they were going to say if you're an athlete you can do just as well on this diet, and at some point it seemed like they switch the mantra to this is an even better way of eating and you can even be in better health. And I think that's where get a lot of different debunkings going on around the interwebs these days. But
and the other thing you just brought up is that kind of all or nothing approach. And I would hate for an athlete to go, gosh, I couldn't go vegan, so what's the point? Let me go back to my regular diet. No, there's that middle ground, right? We want you to make progress. We don't want you to necessarily aim for what you consider perfection, but just make some progress. There's middle ground in there where you can make major gains.
For sure, and as you mentioned there as well, just that period of even experimentation. If someone wants to jump on for a little period and all of a sudden they're eating more lentils or they're eating more salad or they're eating more broccoli, and now we've scored a win there from this period. Win. So that's a big potential win there.
Yeah, huge win. Lentils, one of my favorite foods.
Amazing. Well, listen, performance nutrition obviously in the last 20 years has really exploded. In the last 10 years even more so. Where do you see the evolution of performance nutrition, sport dietetics going in the next 5 or 10 years?
I see it becoming more individualized. I have more and more athletes asking for these specialized blood tests, or they want to know about their microbiome, which I don't think we're there yet with, the microbiome, and because everybody's is, different. It's not like yours is the exact same as mine. That's kind of a misnomer that's floating out there. But I do think we're looking at more individualized approach, getting into some of those nuances, even though, for some athletes, they've got to start with, the things that will give them the biggest bang for the buck. It's like, we don't need to look at, in-depth blood work when you're not even doing X, Y, and Z right, when you can't even, like, let's say, maintain a healthy weight or get up and eat, breakfast and eat at least 3 meals a day. But I do see that individualized approach down the pipeline. What do you think in this regard?
Yeah, I think it's very true in the sense of we're always going to have those pillars that we need to, as fundamentals, big rocks, if you will, that we need to get into all the athletes. But there's definitely, once those are sound and solidified, that personalization part is huge. And, like you mentioned before, I mean, in terms of doing research studies, it's incredibly difficult to be able to tease a lot of these things out. And I think with the use of continuous glucose monitors and things like that, we can start to get a little bit of a glimpse of how, one individual might react a certain way to a food, whereas another might not. And some of the genetic tests as well, obviously there's a lot of associations with a lot of the genes, but some of the ones that are coding for things like caffeine metabolism and things like that are more actionable. I think that's pretty interesting as well. And listen, Marie, I think a lot of people listening in who are trying to continue their skills and continue their journey in nutrition, dietetics, as a strength coach who utilizes nutrition, etc. What's one tip that you would give someone who's trying to continue to add tools to their toolbox and expand their knowledge in nutrition?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say use social media to find some of those experts, follow them, engage in discussions. I think actually that's a great way to learn now. I get this question a lot, and I'm like, there is no one single resource on the web or one single credential. I hate to say it because I'm the lead author on a textbook, but I don't think there's one single textbook out there that will do you justice. But if you follow people like you, if you follow all these people who are experts in the field, and some of these PhD scientists, they're very engaging with their discussion, their information they put out there, and I think that's a great way to continue to learn.
Yeah, great piece of advice. I mean, there's obviously a lot of noise out there in the Twitterverse, but there's, as you mentioned, there's a gold mine as well, and all these experts who now you can talk to directly, and with technology, get people like yourself on the podcast to share your insights is phenomenal. And so definitely.
And that's another one. Listen to podcasts like yours. I mean, you got great guests. I think podcasts. It's funny. I tend to read, but I've gotten into podcasts because I can listen to them on my today hour and a half commute home. So it's a great way to download them, and wherever you are, you have that information. You can rewind it. Podcasts are incredibly helpful as well.
Awesome, Marie. Well, listen, I appreciate you carving out some time. We'll maybe have to get you back on in the summertime to talk a little bit more baseball, because we didn't get a chance to dive in too much on that. But where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your fantastic work?
I'm on Instagram. I'm pretty active on Instagram, at Marie Spano. Not many people have my name, as I always tell my parents, so it's pretty easy to find me. And then my blog, and then Twitter. Those are probably the easiest places to find me. And again, just most of them are just mariespano.com or at Marie Spano on Twitter and Instagram.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely include those in the show notes. And Marie, again, thanks so much for taking the time.